Welcome to the Prairie FILES, a true crime podcast. Welcome to episode 5, Isquahu, the Buffalo Narrows Massacre. Disclaimer. Please note, trigger warning. This podcast contains graphic depictions of gruesome violence that may be alarming to some listeners. Listener discretion is advised. In this episode, we go to history-rich Buffalo Narrows, Saskatchewan. Buffalo Narrows is a village in northwestern Saskatchewan, about 4 hours north of Prince Albert in Canada. Today, it's a community of 1,400 people located in the Narrows, a skinny piece of land between Peter Pond Lake and Churchill Lake, with Highway 155 running straight through the middle of it. The popular bridge that crosses the Callous Channel was built in 1981, which replaced a small ferry. Buffalo Narrows, or Detroit de Boeuf, as it was called in French, was founded in the early 20th century as a trapping, mink ranching, and fish settlement by Scandinavian traders. The community was developed around an earlier Dene settlement. The majority of the community are Aboriginal and proud to call the Narrows home. Many are still traditional land users through hunting, trapping, fishing, and teaching the youth their culture. The population is getting younger, with the average age of 25 years old. Being a fairly remote location, with limited activities and resources for the modern youth, drugs, crime, and substance abuse have been an issue. But they are making strides with government programs and zero-tolerance policies. Let's face it though, crime and addiction is everywhere. We go back 52 years to the village of Buffalo Narrows. It was the late evening hours of January 29th, 1969. The wind was howling, and the snowdrifts would grow larger and larger against the modest homes. It was bitter cold outside, minus 40 degrees Celsius. And the Pederson family was winding down for the night, getting ready to turn in after they had just had a little get-together with family and friends. Drinks, music, and lots of laughs would be commonplace at the Pedersons' home, always welcoming friends and family. Everybody had left but John, a close friend and in-law, was staying with them because he had become estranged from his wife recently, and the Pedersons welcomed him with open arms. The immediate Pederson family was composed of Mr. and Mrs. Pederson and their 7 children. Thomas and his wife Bernadette were raising a growing family, but he had just recently been laid off at his sawmill job 10 days earlier. This was no issue though, as he was well known to be well-to-do. He had a lot of hands-on skills, never had an issue providing for his family. In the wee early morning hours of January 30th, 1969, after everyone in the house had fallen asleep, it was around 1 a.m. when 2 loud thuds would echo through the Narrows. 2 holes would be punched through the front door of the Pedersons' home, where an intruder would reach through the hole and unlock the door. He would then enter. The intruder, who would have been recognized by anyone in the family if they just had the chance to see him. Right after he entered, he came across family friend John, who shot up from the sofa in the living room where he was sleeping. Startled and confused, he sees the silhouette of a fire axe gleaming against the midnight moonlight. Did John see the intruder's face? Did he think he was a fireman? We will never know. because before he knew it, the axe-wielding intruder swiftly struck him in the head with the axe. He dropped to the ground. Evidence would later tell us he then tried to get up again, where he was hit 2 more times before finally coming to rest on the floor, face up in a pool of his own blood. The intruder then ran into the bedroom of Thomas and Bernadette, where they were still sleeping. After having a few drinks that night, they were probably out like a light. The intruder then hit Thomas first, most likely killing him instantly. Then he would turn his axe on Thomas's wife. He would strike her numerous times, the blows so vicious she would be unrecognizable. Then the unthinkable would happen. He entered the children's room. One by one, he would bludgeon them with the front and the back of the axe head. Blood would be splashed and found everywhere in the room, including the ceiling. The family members would lay in their beds as if they had never woken up from a peaceful sleep. The intruder then carefully stood the axe head up against the wall in Thomas's room, and he finished 3 beers that were sitting out from the night of drinking. The axe murderer would then flee the house in a zombie-like state, stumbling through the yards and up the streets to his cousin's house, where his aunt and cousin would be shocked to see him at this hour with blood all over him. Frantically, they asked him what he was doing and what he had done. The killer would only repeat, "I just killed someone." I am sure they were shocked and horrified that he would kill someone, but not realizing the extent of what he had actually done. All he wanted was the telephone and a phone number. He asked his aunt for the village clergy member, Reverend Andrew Charchet's phone number, and called him. The Reverend would end up hanging up on him because he sounded drunk, but after 20 minutes or so, he called back, and this time he would answer and listen to the dark words that the killer would speak. "I just killed a bunch of people," he would tell the Reverend. "I have sinned," he would confess. He insisted over and over that the clergymen go over to the Pedersons and perform a holy oil ritual and give their last rites. He would also eerily say 2 of the family members were still alive. After hanging up, the Reverend called RCMP, hoping it was some sort of a prank. He would bolt out the door afterwards towards the Pedersons' home. About 40 minutes after the unrelenting attack, the Reverend showed up at the Pedersons' house. He would make a nauseating discovery. As he entered the house, he found family friend John Baptiste Herman, 48, of La Loche, lying on his back with extreme trauma to his face and head. He would then peek into the bedrooms. Lying in their beds as if they were still asleep, he discovered Thomas and Bernadette, 32 and 30 respectively, along with their children, Grace Ann, 9, Robert Thomas, 6, Richard Daniel, 5, Frederick Donald, 7, and Rhonda Beatrice, 3, all appeared to be dead in their bed. On this night, only 5 of the children were home, as 2 daughters were having a sleepover at Grandma's, and they would be spared. However, their life would be anything but easy moving forward. Shortly after the Reverend arrived at the Pederson house, first responders showed up. Corporal Jack Fraser and Constable Walter Tucker arrived to see the grisly sight. Fraser would later describe the moments. When he got to the Pederson house, he found Thomas and Bernadette in their bed. He was quoted as saying, "The upper parts of the bodies completely saturated with blood. Their heads were mutilated." He said there was a long-handled fire axe standing against the wall with blood and hair on it. He describes the front room where he found the body of Herman lying on his back. In another bedroom, I saw the bodies of 4 little children. There were 2 little dogs in the room, which I removed from the building, Fraser said. He and the other officer left the house to call for medical help. Back in those days, an ambulance driver with a nurse would respond to medical emergencies. The officers quickly returned and spoke with the Reverend. They were able to figure out who the killer was, and they headed to his aunt's house. Just as they were leaving, an ambulance would arrive with nurse Dorothy Dubois and driver Bruce Clark, who would later tell the court it was like a house of horrors with blood spattered everywhere. He said one of the officers was in shock. He kept repeating, "It's a bloody massacre, it's a bloody massacre," as he stood at the door, going back and forth to the sink to get a glass of water. The level-headed Nurse Dubois said when she arrived with the ambulance, she shined a light into the kids' room, and Frederick sat right up with blood all over his face. He must have just came to at this point. She then went to another room and saw the parents. She would describe the head wound of Mrs. Pederson. Quote, "The whole side of her head was split open, right from the eye around to the back. Incredibly, she was still alive, clinging to life. She had a slight pulse." They then rushed mother and son south out of the village across the frozen Keesis Channel, which in the summer had a small ferry that operates to get cars across, as there was no bridge at this time. They arrived at St. Joseph's Hospital in Île-de-la-Crosse in about 30 minutes, where doctors would try and save their lives. Unfortunately, shortly after arriving, Bernadette would die from her injuries. Fortunately, though, Fred was stabilizing and would later be transferred to St. Paul's Hospital in Saskatoon by air ambulance for better trauma care. Media reports talk of heroics by Nurse Mary Hill, Nurse Dubois, and the ambulance attendants who were credited with saving the boy's life. It was an extremely cold and frigid night at the Hutchinson's flying service hangar when they stretchered him onto the air ambulance. When they arrived in Saskatoon, media talks about the boy being totally encased in green blankets, zippered and hooded. The blanket looked strangely warm and bright, media reports would state. Fred's head was swathed in white bandages that would glow next to the snow outside, and the boy didn't move, as if he was not even alive. Fred sustained a skull fracture, and along with that, most likely brain damage. Police said he was struck on the back of the head. Fred was extremely lucky, as the hits to his head were described by doctors as glancing blows. It's possible that because of the relentless hits to the other kids, and the cushion beneath him would create a bouncing motion, causing the glancing blows, instead of a direct hit, sparing Fred's life. Meanwhile, the RCMP descended on the killer's aunt's house. Inside, they found Frederick Moses McCallum, 19 years of age, in the home sipping tea. Then, the RCMP told McCallum he was under arrest for the murder, and he responded, "Sure, I killed them, so what?" The officer then advised McCallum that he did not have to make a statement to police. But then McCallum would interrupt and say, quote, "They're not all dead. 3 are still alive." Then he told the officer that he hopes he gets the electric chair for what he's done. When the officer didn't respond, McCallum then said, quote, "I was going to get you too with an axe tonight. I'll kill you when I get out." He would also say how he was not happy with the fact that he didn't finish the job and kill all the family members. This would absolutely haunt the surviving family members for decades to come. 2 of the children survived, as they were not home at the time. Connie and Cynthia Pederson. They were spending the night at their grandmother's house. Some reports say it was a friend's house. Either way, they were spared from the massacre, but they went on to have nothing but trouble throughout their life. Elise Pederson, who was Mr. Pederson's sister, would care for them in the meantime while they figured this mess out. After declaring the family members dead, they were shortly thereafter flown to Prince Albert for autopsy and then sent back to Buffalo Narrows so arrangements could be made for their funeral and burial. Authorities remained in the town for a few days while they investigated further. Funeral services were held at 2 p.m. on February 4th, 1969, at the Roman Catholic Church in Buffalo Narrows. Officiated by Reverend Norman, they were buried in the community cemetery. And 600 people would attend the funeral, which is basically the entire population at the time in Buffalo Narrows. The community was utterly shocked by the grisly murders, and they ended up closing various stores, including the liquor store. Plays were also canceled at the theaters because they were of the murder mystery genre. The entire country was already heartbroken because 17 months earlier, the Shell Lake Massacre happened, just 4 hours southeast of Buffalo Narrows, where the Pederson family, composed of 9 members, were shot to death by Victor Hoffman, a 21-year-old laborer. It was quite ironic, as the names of the families were pretty much the same, just spelt differently. However, in these communities, the names Pederson, Pederson are all quite common. Mrs. Reader Pederson of Millhurst, Alberta, who was Thomas Pederson's mom, was so distraught over the killings that she had to be sedated and be under the care of a nurse until her death. She would never be the same. On January 31st, McCallum was in court to face the charges. He pleaded his innocence. The leading post out of Regina would describe the 19-year-old youth who looked, quote, younger than his years, sat quietly in the magistrate's court on a dark Friday night. The hearing would only take 8 minutes. His head bowed as he heard the 7 charges of non-capital murder read out loud to him. A small-statured young man, standing at 5 feet 6 inches tall, maybe 130 pounds, was remanded into custody until February 7th, so they could have time to complete a psychiatric evaluation. The judge, Thomas Agnew, asked the accused if there was a specific lawyer he wanted. No, McCallum said. The judge asked him if he would like him to find one for him. He replied, if you want to. J. H. Klein Heradens was the court-appointed defense counsel for McCallum. He said in a phone interview with media that he was hoping his client would be sent to Saskatoon, where more extensive tests could be done on him. At this point, it wasn't a question of who done it. It was a question of, is this man sane? On February 7th, the counsel for McCallum complained that his client's living conditions were very difficult while being held. He was held in small rooms that were lit 24/7 and under constant surveillance. His examinations were not finished, so he was then remanded until February 14th, and then again on February 28th, where Judge Agnew set a tentative date for the preliminary hearing, which would be set at March 10th, which would be closed to the press. He ordered under Section 451 of the Criminal Code that only the prosecutor, the accused, and counsel, witnesses, and court officials would be allowed in the court. The judge would explain that it would be unfair for the accused to have evidence from the preliminary published. This date would later be changed to March 14th. 30 witnesses were scheduled to be heard. Then, on March 14th, the court was put over again until March 21st, pending further psychiatric examinations. I think they were going back and forth with whether he was mentally ill or not. On March 21st, he was then remanded again every week until the psych reports were fully completed. On May 24th, Sergei Gajara, Saskatchewan's chief public prosecutor, was outraged at the delay, and he would oppose any more delays. More and more delays would happen as they had to get it right with the psychiatric evaluations. Another issue would arise. It was the makeup of the jury pool. The defense was outraged that it was made up of 50 people, none of which were Aboriginal. The judge would turn the motion down that challenged the pool, and an all-white jury of 12 males was selected. Trial was finally set for October 18th, 1969. And McCallum's plea remained not guilty. He would only face 2 counts of murder as the rest were withdrawn. Back then, you couldn't serve more than a life sentence before being eligible for parole, and you were basically discounted heavily if you did a multi-killing. It's a good thing that has changed today. On the first day of trial, McCallum was present in the court with his dark hair and slim build, looking like a child, wearing a black suit and open-neck blue shirt. Initially, McCallum was considered fit to stand trial for non-capital murder. Justice Walker Tuckett of Saskatoon's Court of Queen Bench would leave it to the jury of 12 men to decide if he was fit. A surprise development came up when Dr. Frank Coburn of Saskatoon stated the accused showed signs of schizophrenia. He interviewed McCallum for 2 hours while under the influence of the infamous pentothal, a drug sometimes referred to as truth serum. Back in these days, they really experimented on patients and used all sorts of now banned drugs to try and get into their minds. Later, a huge scandal would cause the entire country to revamp their psychological treatment of mental health patients. Dr. Coburn would tell the court that under the drug, McCallum would act confused and contradictory. His remarks would center around homicidal fantasies directed towards the RCMP. He also described his troubled family background. Coburn testified that McCallum told him, quote, "I woke up in the middle of the room. It smelled awful, like blood. I was in a sort of trance, like a dream. I was dazed, and I ran to Tommy, and he too was dead. I don't know what I would do to the guy if I ever caught him. I looked in the mirror to see if it was myself. I brought the axe up and tried my damnedest to stop. I couldn't stop." End quote. These were all his words while drugged, the doctor said. While not drugged, McCallum told Dr. Coburn that when in jail in February of 1966 at the Prince Albert Penitentiary while serving minor offenses, on several occasions he would hear his name being called, but he couldn't see anyone calling. He described looking into the mirror and seeing his face distorted, one eye bigger than the other. Also, when the radio talked about crime or criminals, he feared they were always talking about him. He was in true fear that he would be a criminal or was a criminal. His activities and strange behaviors led Dr. Coburn to his schizophrenia diagnosis. Dr. Coburn went on to tell the court other things McCallum would say. McCallum said, "I thought about killing people for a couple of years before. I thought about killing Mounties. I hated them so much, I would torture them slowly," McCallum would say. When McCallum was asked what he thought about the killer of the Shell Lake Massacre, after reading about it in the paper, he surprisingly said, quote, "I'd kill him the day I got my hands on him. I couldn't see myself shooting an infant." It was a strange thing for him to say, as he had just bludgeoned 5 children himself. It was quite obvious he was also suffering from multiple personalities, as he would jump from one to another in the middle of conversations. One moment, he was a caring man. The next, he was a brutal homicidal lunatic. In the last interview, McCallum would say, "The Pedersons were very good friends. I love life. I've had fun. The kids thinking the world of me. They don't show it, but they do. I'm not crazy," he said multiple times. When McCallum was first charged with the murders, he said, quote, "I felt like fainting. I didn't believe it. I love kids. I'd do anything for a child." He eventually also said 2 of the kids were still alive, and that God told him that. The jury then heard from expert pathologists and witnesses. Dr. Oliver Lane said the fatal injuries inflicted could have been caused by a long-handed fire axe, which was introduced as evidence. The pathologist would say, "I think they both died rapidly," talking about both men that he had murdered. He said all deaths were caused from the head injuries. McCallum's cousin, 15-year-old Cora Gardner, visibly shaken, testified that McCallum ran to her house after the murders to phone the church. He said Mr. Herman wouldn't die. He had to chop him 3 times in the head, but Tommy and the other kids died at once, she would testify. The little boy Fred, who would turn 8 a week later, surprisingly testified in court, wearing a plaid shirt and brown corduroy trousers, sucking his thumb in a shy manner. "I got chopped," he said. This was completely shocking for anyone to hear. He said he did not see McCallum at any time before he went to sleep, and he referred to him as the nickname Benny. Next, defense counsel asked Corporal Cormier if there were any prints on the axe handle after seeing it was completely covered in print soot. The officer testified there were no prints found, but there were some found on the beer bottles. These prints would match McCallum's. The defense would constantly emphasize McCallum's upbringing. He told the jury who McCallum actually was as a person and what he had been through in his lifetime. As a child, his father was not around. He lived with his mother and was only one of 10 siblings. He lived there until he was 11, when he was taken away by social services. His mother was never married, and every sibling was from a different father. His childhood was extremely unhappy, and his mother was a woman who drank all the time and was always on welfare. She would neglect the kids, and they were pretty much on their own. Without being fed or properly clothed, they were often outside in the winter months, sporting a thin jacket or just a sweater. Most of the kids ended up being taken away as a part of the infamous 60s scoop, where many children were taken from troubled homes. However, we are also now learning that it wasn't always from troubled homes. Some children were taken from homes full of love to fill the residential schools ran by the Catholic Church. Others were placed in foster care with non-Indigenous families, which would strip them of their culture and creating identity problems for them later on in life. McCallum was put into foster care and ran away often. His only happy time was in Swift Current in southern Saskatchewan, when he was with a family and community that he felt accepted him. However, he felt lonely and missed the northern country and eventually returned to Buffalo Narrows. The defense really tried to sell McCallum as a victim himself. After all witnesses were called, both sides had rested their cases, and just before the jury left to deliberate, defense counsel would again tell them to consider whether at the time of the murder the accused was sane or insane. Quote, "What do you do with a man with a sick mind? Lock him up like an animal? There were days, and there were times, when there were no alternatives. He hasn't smiled in 10 years. Do you think that is of any significance?" End quote. Kujawa, the Crown prosecutor, also said he agreed with the defense that the question of the accused's mental condition is the key and really the only issue. On October 22nd, after 4.5 hours, the 12 jury members would find Frederick Moses McCallum not guilty by reason of insanity. The jury's decision means he will be confined to an institution for an indefinite time. When jury foreman Leonard Ushka announced the decision of not guilty by means of insanity, McCallum showed no emotion. Justice Walter Tucker then spoke, quote, "I order that the accused in this case be kept in strict custody in the Prince Albert Correctional Institution until the pleasure of the Lieutenant Governor of Saskatchewan is known." In the January 15th, 1970s edition of the Leader Post Regina, the paper states, Frederick Moses McCallum, now 20, after spending a year at Penetanguishene, an Ontario psychiatric facility, he was then transferred to the Saskatchewan Penitentiary at Prince Albert on recommendations of a psychiatrist's report. In the report it said, while he was mentally ill at the time of the crime, he was not mentally ill now and did not require further treatment. The report said he should be detained in a maximum security institution. However, he was transferred back and forth before remaining at the maximum security prison for quite some time. To date, many questions remain. Nobody really knows what the true motive was to these senseless losses of life. What made him do it? Why did he choose the family that he called friends? A possible motive that emerged was the Pederson family had a small party that night, and before the killings, McCallum was told to leave. Thomas apparently was tired of him mooching beers off of him, so he wouldn't give him any. The altar boy, who apparently was good at hockey, snapped when he was told to leave the party. McCallum then went back later that night and took his building frustrations out on the Pederson family in a schizophrenic state of rage. This case sparked debates among the welfare minister and the federal government, and it was proposed that a new institution to treat the criminally insane be built. They were hoping the facility would be built in 1971 or 1972, but nothing was ever built until many, many years later. After that, the case was closed and life went on for the community. Community members would start to forget, or at least it seemed like it. It was over in the courtroom, but it was far from over for the family. It was only the beginning of a generational trauma that would span few generations. The two surviving sisters, Connie and Cynthia, would be taken in briefly by social services, even though their grandmother wanted them. They were sent to Saskatoon, where they somehow convinced a family to take them back to their grandma. They would then live with their grandma for about 4 years until she got sick and they became homeless because the grandma could not care for them anymore. Social services this time would abandon them. No calls or no checkups. Connie quit school at the age of 12 and had to work as a janitor and also various other jobs. Later on, they were able to get some welfare, but that's never enough. They also would say they did some things they don't want to talk about to make ends meet. Frederick Donald Pederson, who survived, would become extremely troubled. He would spend most of his younger years in a youth camp for troubled kids. Donnie, they called him, would later go on to push for changes in these camps, which wouldn't actually be recognized until many years later. Once he was an adult, he would pursue crime constantly. He would commit crimes so he could get the chance at being locked up, so he could face his family's killer. Meanwhile, the whole time, McCallum wasn't even in the province. Eventually, he got out of jail and started a family
He started to turn his life around, and things looked pretty good. His sisters would later say how much he loved his kids, but like many, dysfunctions would take over. Donnie and Cynthia were out one night when a car hit the side of theirs on the highway, clipping the mirror. Cynthia would get out to check the damage, but she would be hit by another car coming the other way, sending her flying through the air. The car would then hit their car, sending it into Donnie, who was also outside of the car. Donnie would be struck by the car and would die on the scene. Fortunately, Cynthia would later recover from her injuries, but this would push Connie into another level of sorrow and fright. The anxiety was so bad for Connie from the traumas and nightmares she's been dealing with. She was especially scared of losing her family. Connie would tell CBC she was so afraid of her family's killer that she would lock the windows over and over until they broke. She would leave Buffalo Narrows when her anxiety got so bad, or when the McCallum family was having a family reunion. It really seemed to affect Connie the most and made her extremely overprotective. In the Doc Project, they talked about not being able to trust anyone or even love anyone. They loved their families, but they had a hard time connecting. To make things worse, the sisters would later say that the village wasn't even supportive as they grew up. They always offered help, but they would never follow up, the sisters would say. After a 2019 CBC Saskatchewan story on the 50th anniversary of the little-known Buffalo Narrows Massacre, the women received inquiries from people who wanted to help financially. This was great. The sisters decided to create a GoFundMe page to refurbish their family's headstones, which they did. It was a single headstone, though. The sisters were grateful, but wanted to know why more wasn't done then. They only received 1 hour of mental health supports during the whole ordeal and spent years homeless and were never even updated on the court cases. They had gotten unconfirmed reports out of Ontario in the 90s that said McCallum was released after 20 years in 1989 with conditions that he should never return to Saskatchewan. However, his current whereabouts remains unknown. One source shows he was reinstitutionalized at a later date, and others say he's living in Ontario, a free man. The sisters would later learn that they can apply for information about McCallum, but they remain way too traumatized to move forward even after all these years. 51 years later, in 2020, CBC did some interviews with the sisters, now in their 60s. Connie, who was 10, and Cynthia, who was 11 at the time, both married now with families and grandchildren, have deep emotional scars. After many years in raising children of their own, their grandchildren had to learn of the massacre on the schoolyard. This made Connie even more heartbroken after everything she's been through. How could her grandchildren find out this way? I hope Connie and Cynthia find closure and possibly can enjoy the rest of their lives with their grandkids. But I'm sure it's a long, hard road ahead. And always remember, if you or anyone you know is suffering from mental health issues, we've come a long way and there's many supports available. The Canada Suicide Prevention Service at 1-833-456-4566. Kids Help Phone. Call 1-800-668-6868. You can also text 686868. Also, Hope for Wellness Helpline. Call 1-855-242-3310. This is a service available to all Indigenous peoples across Canada who are in need of immediate crisis intervention. Experienced and culturally sensitive helpline counselors can help you if you need to talk or are distressed. This concludes episode 5, Iskawaho. Thanks for listening, and talk to you soon.